All right, let's get down to it, huh? Today we're going to be diving deep into the trenches of the war in Ukraine and dissecting a recent audio commentary that's providing some really raw intel straight from the front lines. So it's a peek behind the curtain at the human cost of this conflict and the simmering tensions that aren't making headlines. You know what I mean?
It's amazing how this source just cuts through the polished narratives we're so used to. We're going to explore the soldier's perspective, the fraying political alliances, and what this all means for the future.
Yeah, exactly. Think of this deep dive as your crash course in understanding what's really happening on the ground.
Right. It's important to keep in mind that this is just one perspective, but it does offer some valuable insights into the complexities of this war that are often overlooked.
Hey, let's jump right in. What really stood out to me was how even the Washington Post is starting to acknowledge these cracks in the official narrative. I've interviewed Ukrainian soldiers, and the pessimism is just palpable.
Yeah, it's a pretty significant shift. I mean, we've been bombarded with this "we will fight to the end" messaging, but these soldiers are painting a very different picture. They're expressing war weariness, disillusionment, and even fear of being abandoned by their allies.
One soldier even said, "I'm afraid we'll be abandoned." That's not exactly a ringing endorsement, right? And it's not just talk. Look at the 33rd Mechanized Brigade, decked out with Western tech, trained by foreign experts. They seem poised for this, major counteroffensive.
And now they're relegated to just defense, struggling with morale. Really highlights the gap between the initial expectations and the realities of this war.
High hopes meet the grind of the front lines. And speaking of grinding realities, the geopolitical landscape is shifting pretty dramatically, too. We're seeing alliances crumble in unexpected ways.
Yeah, the relationship between Ukraine and Slovakia is a perfect example. I mean, it's especially ironic considering Ukraine relies on Slovakia for electricity. After those Russian strikes on their infrastructure.
Right. But now there's this political conflict brewing. Former Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico is under criminal investigation. And he's retaliating by threatening to cut off that vital electricity supply. It's like they're fighting a war on two fronts, one against Russia and the other against these internal and external pressures.
And it's not just Slovakia either. The source points to strained relations with Hungary as well. Viktor Orban has been increasingly critical, and there's a chance he could cut off vital resources too. How stable are these alliances really as the war drags on? And these countries face their own internal challenges.
Some people argue that, Western support is unwavering, but how do you reconcile that with these signs of waning commitment? It's a high wire act for Ukraine, relying on support from nations that are increasingly wary and, dealing with their own issues. And then there's the whole Leopard tank debacle.
Oh, yeah, the German-made tanks that were supposed to be a game changer, but the reality's been quite different.
Germany pledged 155 Leopard tanks, but almost 2 years later, only 58 have been delivered.
Yeah.
And the reason for the delay? Spare parts issues.
It's just a logistical nightmare that really underscores the complexities of international support. And this directly impacts units like the 33rd Brigade, who are trained to use these tanks, further affecting their combat readiness and morale.
It's a cascading impact, where one problem fuels another. Delays lead to frustration, which erodes morale and ultimately impacts performance on the battlefield. And this is all happening against the backdrop of this deepening manpower crisis in Ukraine.
Yeah, the source paints a pretty stark picture of their struggle to maintain a fighting force.
They're relying on older recruits, and there are even reports of increasingly desperate measures to fill the ranks. We're talking about targeting vulnerable populations like homeless people and people struggling with addiction. That's a pretty grim situation.
Yeah, it raises serious concerns about the long-term sustainability of their war effort, especially with no clear end in sight. And to add to that complexity, we see reports of 13 brand new Rolls-Royces being purchased in Ukraine.
It's crazy, right? This manpower crisis is unfolding amidst a backdrop of just stark inequality. So while soldiers are scrounging for supplies, someone's out there enjoying a very comfortable ride. These luxury vehicles, each costing upwards of $600,000, were reportedly purchased by figures connected to the former President Yanukovych, and even some current figures like Serhiy Prikula.
It just adds another layer to the narrative, doesn't it? While some are sacrificing on the front lines, others seem to be profiting from the war.
And then there's the issue of conscription. Zelensky's facing pressure to lower the conscription age to bolster the ranks, but he's pushing back, despite the fact that his Western allies are urging him to do so. I mean, isn't he in kind of a tough spot? He needs more soldiers. But he also has to consider public opinion.
It's a very delicate balancing act, and this resistance could foreshadow some future conflicts, especially as the war drags on. and the demand for fresh troops intensifies.
Yeah, for sure. But for the soldiers who've already been fighting since day one, there's another looming issue: demobilization, or rather, the lack of it.
Yeah, this is where the source takes a really dark turn, revealing the psychological toll of this indefinite service.
It's being described as a one-way ticket to war, with no clear exit strategy. This uncertainty obviously discourages voluntary enlistment and contributes to the already low morale. This whole demobilization issue raises so many questions. What struck you as the most concerning?
Well, what's particularly troubling is that this isn't even a new issue. The source mentions past statements made by Zelensky about demobilization, but they lack clarity, and they come across as potentially manipulative rhetoric.
So we've got soldiers feeling abandoned, alliances are crumbling, manpower shortages, and a demobilization dilemma. It's a far more complicated picture than the headlines suggest.
Yeah, for sure. It's so important to dig deeper and question the narratives being presented.
Absolutely. And that this demobilization debate takes another twist. When you consider the power dynamics at play, the source describes this back and forth between Zelensky and the former commander-in-chief,
Zelensky proposed a 36-month service limit. Basically, soldiers could expect to return home after 3 years of service, but Zelensky initially rejected it. It's been framed as this power struggle with potentially significant consequences.
And what's even more curious is the sudden disappearance of protest by families who are demanding clearer demobilization policies.
Right. It raises questions about potential suppression or manipulation by the government, adding another layer of distrust to an already tense situation.
So this 36-month limit, initially seen as a potential solution, is now stuck in legal limbo.
The proposed rest options, that would supposedly allow soldiers these brief periods away from the front lines. They just feel more like a tactic to stall demobilization than a genuine solution. And to make matters worse, even these inadequate proposals have been rejected by the general staff. It's a bleak situation for those on the front lines. They're caught in this bureaucratic web, their hopes of returning to normal life constantly being dashed.
And all of this is happening against a backdrop of silence regarding the true human cost of the war. The casualty numbers. There's a concerning lack of transparency. Could the government be hiding the true cost of the war to avoid public outcry and pressure to bring soldiers home?
It's a chilling possibility. This reluctance to release accurate casualty figures could definitely be connected to the resistance towards demobilization. It's a reminder that there's often more to these stories than meets the eye.
Absolutely. It's so crucial to consider the complexities and potential motivations behind the official narratives. But there's much more to uncover. Stay with us as we delve even deeper into this commentary, exploring some of the more surprising revelations and their potential implications.
Welcome back. So before the break, we were talking about this difficult reality for Ukrainian soldiers. No clear path to demobilization, mounting pressure to keep fighting.
Yeah, it's a heavy situation. The psychological weight of indefinite service is just immense. And the source really emphasized that it feels like a one-way ticket for a lot of these soldiers. No wonder morale is so low.
Right, exactly. And that sense of hopelessness, it's just compounded by this lack of transparency surrounding the casualty numbers. I mean, the government's reluctance to release accurate figures raises some serious questions. Are they trying to hide the true human cost of this war, to avoid even more public outcry and pressure to bring their soldiers home?
It's a disturbing thought, but it makes you wonder. This lack of transparency seems to go beyond just casualty numbers, too. Remember the sudden disappearance of those protests by families who were demanding clearer demobilization policies?
Yeah, that's a big red flag. The source hints at possible suppression or even manipulation by the government, which further erodes trust. It's like there's this parallel reality unfolding, the official narrative versus the lived experiences of those on the ground.
And that disconnect is amplified by these conflicting messages coming from those in power, like the back and forth between Zelensky and former commander-in-chief Zelensky about the proposed 36-month service limit.
Right. Initially, it seemed like a potential compromise, a glimmer of hope for these soldiers who are desperate to return to civilian life. But then Zelensky rejected it. And the whole thing became entangled in this political maneuvering.
Yeah, it almost feels like individual ambitions and political calculations are overshadowing the needs of the people who are actually putting their lives on the line. And even those rest options, which were far from a true return home, have been rejected by the general staff.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, we know you're exhausted, but too bad. It's a pretty disheartening message for those who've sacrificed so much.
And it all circles back to this concerning quality of troops being deployed. With the manpower shortages and the reluctance to demobilize experienced soldiers, they're relying more and more on older recruits and those with limited training.
The source mentions reports of vulnerable populations being targeted for conscription. Homeless people, people struggling with addiction. Desperate times, desperate measures, I guess.
But you can't just throw bodies into a conflict and expect positive results.
Yeah.
It raises serious concerns about the preparedness and effectiveness of the Ukrainian forces.
Precisely. And the situation is further complicated by these ongoing delays. In receiving the promised military aid from Western partners, Leopard tank situation is a prime example of how these logistical challenges and bureaucratic hurdles can have a significant impact on the battlefield.
Yeah, it's like showing up for a race with your shoes untied. You might have the potential, but you're not equipped to succeed.
Exactly. While Germany did eventually start delivering the tanks, those initial delays really impacted units like the 33rd Brigade. They were trained to use them, but they were left waiting for months.
That sense of being ill-equipped and unsupported just contributes to the declining morale we've been talking about. And it's all happening against the backdrop of shifting geopolitical alliances and increasing pressure on Ukraine's partners to maintain their level of support.
Right, the strained relationships with Slovakia and Hungary. Those are just two examples of cracks starting to appear in that unified front that initially formed behind Ukraine.
And with Robert Fico threatening to cut off electricity and Viktor Orban expressing increasing skepticism, the situation is looking more and more precarious. It's like a Jenga tower. Each block removed weakens the structure as a whole.
And as those external pressures mount, so do the internal ones. Remember Zelensky resisting those calls to lower the conscription age, despite the pressure from Western partners?
Yeah, that resistance is probably going to face even greater challenges as the war drags on. And the need for fresh troops intensifies. It's a tough decision, with potentially huge consequences for him politically.
And speaking of tough decisions, the source really highlights how this demobilization issue isn't just legal or logistical, it's a deeply moral one.
These soldiers have served their country, many putting their lives on the line. To deny them a clear path to return to civilian life, that's a betrayal of their sacrifice.
The source also points out the psychological toll, that this uncertainty takes on the soldiers and their families. It's hard to envision a future beyond the battlefield when there's no end in sight.
And that despair is only amplified by the lack of transparency surrounding the true cost of the war. That silence on casualty figures, it just adds to the anxiety and the distrust. It's a lot to grapple with.
It is. It's important to remember that behind the statistics and the political maneuvering, there are real people whose lives are being irrevocably changed by this conflict.
Their stories need to be heard. Their sacrifices need to be acknowledged.
You know, this deep dive has uncovered a much more complex and often contradictory picture of the war in Ukraine than we usually see.
We've seen how that initial optimism and those promises of support have given way to this much harsher reality, declining morale, political maneuvering, and a growing sense of uncertainty.
Yeah, it's a reminder that these conflicts are rarely straightforward, and the narratives that we're presented with often hide the complexities and the human cost.
But this deep dive isn't over yet. There's still more to uncover. Stay with us as we explore some of the more surprising revelations from this source material and what they could mean for the future of the war in Ukraine. Welcome back. We've been talking about some pretty unsettling realities of this war in Ukraine, from the disillusionment among the soldiers to those shaky alliances and the lack of a clear path home for those on the front lines.
Yeah, heavy stuff. But it's so vital to understand the true cost of this conflict. And one of the most striking revelations from the source is this idea that the war has become like a one-way ticket for a lot of these Ukrainian soldiers.
Yeah, that phrase really stuck with me too. It captures the sense of just hopelessness and despair so many are feeling, with no end in sight and no guarantee of returning home. It's no wonder morale is plummeting.
Right, and this uncertainty, it doesn't just weigh on the soldiers, it ripples out to their families, too, leaving them grappling with this constant fear and worry. The burden of this war extends so far beyond the battlefield.
It really does. It's a powerful reminder that behind the statistics and the strategic analysis, there are real people whose lives are being just shattered. And this kind of brings us to another critical point that the source highlights, this control of information. Or rather, the lack of it. We've already talked about the lack of transparency around the casualties, but there's this broader sense of the government controlling the narrative and silencing dissent.
Yeah, the sudden disappearance of those family protests, demanding clearer demobilization policies. It's really hard to see that as anything other than a sign of a government becoming more authoritarian and intolerant of any criticism.
That's a worrying trend. If people are afraid to speak out and challenge the official narrative, how can there be any meaningful accountability or progress toward peace?
Exactly. And the suppression of information, it goes beyond just the demobilization issue. The source also mentions how the government is using the DEA app. You know, the one that was originally designed for those digital services, to track and monitor citizens?
Wait, the DEA app. Most people use that for things like driver's licenses and paying taxes, right?
Right, exactly. It was designed with seemingly noble intentions, but now it's being used in ways that raise serious concerns about privacy and government overreach. It's a chilling example of how technology can be used for good and ill.
It's like convenience morphing into control. And this leads us to another uncomfortable truth revealed in the source: the growing influence of Russia, despite the global condemnation and sanctions.
Yeah, it's a reminder that these conflicts, they're rarely black and white. Even in war, there are these complex relationships and alliances at play. The source mentions how Russian security forces are using data from that very DIA app to track Ukrainians crossing the border into Russia.
That's unnerving. It really speaks volumes about the reach and sophistication of Russian intelligence operations. And it begs the question, how much control does the Ukrainian government really have over its own digital infrastructure?
Right. It exposes this vulnerability that could be exploited in countless ways. Cybersecurity and data protection, more crucial than ever in this digital age.
Absolutely. And speaking of vulnerabilities, the source also touches on the economic challenges Ukraine is facing as the war drags on.
Yeah, we've talked about the strain on resources and those desperate measures to maintain their fighting force. But there's this broader economic impact that's rippling through Ukrainian society.
The source points out how certain individuals, some connected to the former President Yanukovych, are actually profiting from the war, while ordinary citizens are struggling to just get by.
Yeah, it's a stark contrast. It's a tale of two Ukraines, a select few enriching themselves, while the majority face hardship and uncertainty.
And this economic disparity, it's just a recipe for social unrest and political instability down the line.
Absolutely. It's a breeding ground for discontent and potentially extremism.
So we've got soldiers feeling trapped, families torn apart, information being suppressed, Russia exerting its influence, and an economy on the brink. It's a bleak picture, to say the least.
It certainly is. But even in the darkest of times, there's always hope. The source material may not offer easy solutions, but it does provide invaluable insights into this complex and ever-changing conflict.
It reminds us to stay informed, to question the narratives we're given, and to amplify the voices of those who are often silenced.
And most importantly, we must remember that behind the headlines and all the geopolitical maneuvering, there are real people whose lives are being profoundly impacted. Their stories deserve to be heard, and their suffering acknowledged.
As we wrap up this deep dive today, let's take a moment to reflect on the human cost of this war and renew our commitment to peace and justice for all those affected.
And let's not forget that even amidst all the chaos and uncertainty, there's always the possibility of hope and a better future.
That's it for our deep dive today. We hope this conversation has been informative and has given you a lot to think about. As always, we encourage you to continue exploring these issues, seek out diverse perspectives, and engage in thoughtful discussions about creating a more peaceful and just world. Thanks for joining us.